Well, here we are. No, we're not going to have any more cooking shows for a while anyway. Maybe winter I'll do something. But I've got an important issue I want to look at today, and something you can participate in. And if you can't participate in it in Melbourne, you can also participate in your local communities. Now, the 20th of January is an important day, which most people aren't aware of. On the 20th of January 1842, that's 179 years ago, two Australian Tasmanian Aboriginal men, Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheener, were publicly executed in Melbourne, the first people executed in Melbourne for the heinous crime of resisting white colonisation. So what's that got to do with you? 179 years ago. Well, lest we forget. I mean, we use the epitaph, lest we forget, for Anzac Day. Lest we forget all those men and women who've died in wars, 99% of them foreign wars, and remember on Anzac Day. But we have no collective memory regarding the frontier wars that occurred in this country. Now, most of you who are my age wouldn't have even heard of the frontier wars for a variety of reasons. And it's not unusual for people to have no understanding or any idea of the history of this country. This country was colonised. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders had lived on this country continuously for over 2,000 generations. Not 7 generations, but over 2,000 generations. That's over 60,000 years. In this country we have the world's oldest living culture. And unlike almost every other British colony, we have never acknowledged the past, never moved towards doing a treaty, never talk about compensation. And it wasn't until 1992, the 3rd of June 1992, the High Court of Australia in the Mabo decision decided that Indigenous Australians had rights to land in law because of prior occupation of this land. This land was illegally colonised on the fiction that the land belonged to no one. Terra nullius. So between 1788 and 1992, successive Australian governments, state governments before Federation and Australian governments after Federation, continued to act as if history began in 1788. So what's Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheener got to do with it? Well, in 2003, while rummaging through a bookshop in Hampton, a second-hand bookshop, I came across a book which was published in 1986, Jack of Cape Grim, written by the late Joan Roberts. And this documented, to some degree, the life and story of Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheener, the first people publicly executed in Victoria. It documented their story. And it is a fundamental story which affects each and every one of us, because every centimetre of this land is soaked in the blood of those who resisted the colonisation process and who continue to resist the colonisation process, because the Indigenous Australians have never ceded their sovereign rights over this land. No treaty. The Uluru Statement from the Heart in 2017, where a large number of delegates from Aboriginal groups and Torres Strait Islander groups across this country met at Uluru, had 3 demands. 3 requests. They were not demands. We make demands. They make requests. And the request 1 was to tell the truth. Tell the story of the frontier wars. tell the truth. That was the first and foremost demand, because you cannot reconcile without the truth. So after I read this book, I felt to myself that something needed to be done. And in 2006 and 2007, the Anarchist Institute held a commemoration in Melbourne at the site these men had been executed. And in 2008 we formed the Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheener Commemoration Committee to bring this story, it's a story of passion, resistance, rebellion, death, love, a great human story written with blood on this landscape. Tunnerminnerwait came from northwest Tasmania. Maulboyheener came from Ben Lomond in central Tasmania. And they were the last few hundred survivors of the Holocaust which descended on Tasmania when Hobart was established in 1803. Over 15 to 20,000 Tasmanian Aboriginal people had lived in Tasmania for 40,000 years. There were 6 major groups. And when the colonisation process began, it began with the introduction of disease, which saw over 80% of the population of Indigenous Australians die of diseases like diphtheria, whooping cough, measles, mumps, smallpox. We also saw a brutal war which extended for 33 years, which was based on the concept of genocide. It was a war to rid Tasmania of its original inhabitants. And Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheener were part of that war. An Aboriginal protector called George Augustus Robinson was given the task of collecting what was left of the Aboriginal population in Tasmania and taking them to Flinders Island. And he found about 280 survivors of this Holocaust. And Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheener were 2 of these men. And they were taken with their brothers and sisters to Flinders Island in 1835. Within 3 years, there were only 85 Tasmanians left, original inhabitants left. So what did George Augustus Robinson do? A great entrepreneur. He approached the New South Wales government, which was in charge of Victoria in 1842, and offered the services of his Aborigines to civilise the wild blacks in Victoria. Because in Victoria it was the same story. Over 80% of the population had actually been killed by introduced diseases before the first colonists arrived in Melbourne in 1835. And then we had a vicious, undeclared frontier war which saw the massacre of thousands of people driven off their lands till there were less than 2,000 Victorian Aborigines from a population of over 150,000 before colonisation began. So Tunnerminnerwait, Maulboyheener, Planobina, Pitirana, Truganini were 5 of the 17 Tasmanians which were brought across to Victoria in January 1839 to civilise the blacks. Obviously he was paid a handsome retainer. Within a few years this experiment had failed, and the rations which were given to these people were denied them. So Planobina and Tunnerminnerwait, who'd been married in European law, Putirana and Maulboyheener and Truganini took to the bush. They took to the Dandenongs. They took to the Mornington Peninsula. They took to the bush in late August 1841 and began a guerrilla warfare against the colonisers. About 8,000 Europeans were in Melbourne in 1841. And over the next 10 weeks, understanding the white man's ways, because they were the survivors of the 33 Holocaust in Tasmania, they conducted a very effective guerrilla campaign, which was an exceptionally humane campaign. They killed nobody during the initial stages of this campaign. Women and children were released. They were just after guns and supplies, hoping that the local Victorian blacks would join their revolt. Hundreds fled to Melbourne. Armed forces, police, squatters, lynching parties were sent out to capture these five, or to actually kill these five. And eventually on the 20th of November 1841, they came across their campsite, they fired into their campsite, and believe it or not, they all survived. They were taken to court, they were tried under British law. The judge, Judge Willis, raised the point that has there been no treaty with these people, the British legal authorities may not actually have legal jurisdiction over these people. But a jury on the 19th of December 1841 found the two men guilty, Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheener, and found the three women innocent. Judge Willis sentenced them to hang. They were hanged at the site of the old Melbourne jail, which we still see at the corner of Victoria and Franklin Street in Melbourne. This campaign, which we began to a significant degree as a reaction to the fact that we had manufactured reality. Manufactured reality is not just a Trump supporters problem. Manufactured reality has always been an Australian problem. The fact that we refuse to acknowledge the past. They were hung for resisting white colonisation. The three women were sent back. And by this time, of the 17 that had come across, 8 had died, 5 returned, and I think 10 had died, 5 returned, and 2 stayed in Victoria. So it's a great story, but what does it have to do with us in 2021? So what's it got to do with us in 2021? Well, after a 10-year campaign, which was organised by the Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheener Commemoration Committee, 3 members have now died. My late wife Ellen Jose, Joy French, Bill French, and Rick Simpson, another member, is exceptionally sick and will not survive. So I pay my respects to them, as well as obviously to all those men and women and children who died defending their countries. Well, we're involved in a long campaign, a long, bitter campaign, which to a significant degree was helped by Councillor Kaffioka, Greens councillor on the Melbourne City Council, who supported this campaign over the years despite vociferous opposition from the now disgraced Mayor Doyle and his hangers-oners. I stood as mayor twice in 2008 and 2012 to highlight this particular issue. And after a long, bitter campaign, which was resisted by many people, not just Europeans, not just recent migrants, but even certain sections of the indigenous community, we were able to establish the Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheener Commemoration Monument at the corner of Victoria and Franklin Street. This is a monument to the frontier wars. It is the first major monument in a major urban centre in this country to the frontier wars. And on the 20th of January, since 2006, we have had a commemoration at the very spot where these 2 men were hung for resisting white colonisation. Every year at midday we have this commemoration. We have guest speakers, and I invite you to come along Wednesday the 20th of January. Obviously we'll take all COVID-19 restrictions which need to be taken on the day. That won't be an issue, and then we'll walk down to the Queen Victoria markets at 1 p.m. to what we believe is their final resting place. But this is not just about Tunnerminnerwait and Maulboyheener. This is about this country. This is about us. This is about us walking with this country's First Nations people. This is about acknowledging the past. This is about working towards a treaty. This is about compensation. This is about reforming the Native Title Act, which has been made so convoluted that it's almost very difficult for Indigenous Australians to get even native title in this country. This is an exceptionally important commemoration. And there will be other commemorations around this country. Not on the 20th of January, but other days. And obviously we've got the 26th of January, 6 days later, which continues ad nauseum. I'll give you an example. If the Japanese imperial forces successfully invaded Australia on the 20th of January 1942, and Australia Day was celebrated on the 20th of January 2021, obviously there'd be an uproar. This is the nature. We have the colonisers celebrating the day they began the brutality, the day they began the dispossession, the day they could celebrate that day as the day which marks Australia Day. As far as I'm concerned, the 20th of January is a great day. That's why we use the motto, we've always used the motto, lest we forget. In my opinion, this is only my personal opinion, the 20th of January should be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Freedom Fighters Day. We have a special day, Anzac Day, which I've got nothing against, for all those men and women who died in wars fighting for this country, in a great majority of cases overseas. But we have no special day to remember those who resisted colonisations and those who are the victims of colonisation. If we have a special day, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Freedom Fighters Day, as a public holiday in this country, where ceremonies are carried out throughout the country between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and the colonisers, you will find that we can then take another step towards reconciliation. Not reconciliation based on charity, not reconciliation based on guilt, but reconciliation based on the fact that we all enjoy this land and what this land has to offer, a land which was inhabited by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders for over 60,000 years, continuously inhabited. If there is one thing that needs to be addressed in this country, it is this. So join us on the 20th of January, midday. And if you can't join us, there will be a live broadcast streaming live on 3cr.org.au around the world between 12 and 1 on Community Radio 3CR. Think about it. Think about it, move forward, because this is an issue which affects all of us. Those of us who are born here, those of us who have come here as migrants, those of us who are First Nations people, and those of us who have lived here for 6 or 7 generations since colonisation began.